joining with you guys. And I'm delighted to see the legislature on time. Let me get
We're going live.
Let me get rid of this high school photo. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Well, just want to welcome the listening public to the Public Transit, Safety, Transit, and Environment Subcommittee, along with the Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee's hearings. Today, we will be hearing 4 hearings, one on the Comptroller of Maryland, the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, Department of Pretrial Detention, State Police today. Look forward to hearing each hearing. And at this moment, I just want to send it over to my friend over in the House colleague, my counterpart, Delegate Chairman Haynes, if you have any words.
Thank you very much, Chairman McCray. Just want to say good afternoon to everyone. And we have Public Safety Administration all present here, and we're ready to begin whenever you are, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I just want to recognize that we're joined by Senator Doug Peters. We're also joined by Senator Sailing, and we will be joined momentarily by Senator Edwards. We're going to start with our good friend, the Comptroller of Maryland, and we're going to see if we can get the budget analysis from Mr. Samuel Quist.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Samuel Quist. I'll be presenting the analysis for the Comptroller of Maryland. I'm just going to share my screen here. One moment. All right, there we go. The Comptroller of Maryland's budget for fiscal 22 is a total of $156.4 million. This reflects a decrease of $18.5 million or 10.6% from the fiscal 21 working appropriation. This is primarily due to the funding for the integrated tax system major IT project and the fact that a portion of that project funding is through the Do It Major IT Development Fund, which is not allocated until after the session is over through a budget amendment. So that's part of where that gap comes from. I'm going to continue on the bottom of page 7 with the fiscal 21 discussion, if you're following along on a paper copy. The integrated tax system major IT development project in the fiscal 21 appropriation, there was about $21.9 million in additional funds that were added through budget amendment to the original 21 governor's allowance. This was $13.2 million in reimbursable funding from Do It, as well as an additional $8.7 million in special funds that were added through a budget amendment later on in the fiscal year. So as I said, that's primarily where the gap between 21 and 22 comes from. Also for fiscal 21, we have noted that the working appropriation reflects a transfer of 27 positions and $1.6 million from the Comptroller's office to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission for the staffing of that agency effective January 1st. And I'll talk more about that later on in this hearing when we do the analysis for that commission. Also noted in the analysis were the cost containment actions taken by the Board of Public Works. There were $3.4 million in general funds and about $167,000 in special funds that were reduced. These reductions were primarily increases to turnover and through holding positions open agency-wide. There were also some other reductions to various operating expenses and through the elimination of some funding that was restricted by the legislature during last session. Moving to the overview of agency spending on Exhibit 4, this shows the majority of the budget is for personnel expenses, about $95 million or 61%. This covers the approximately 1,100 positions in the agency. The next largest expense are for contracts, and primarily the contracts go towards the Annapolis Data Center and the IT Services Division within the agency. Then there's also the ITS Major IT Development Project. The 22 allowance includes 13.7 million in special funds for that project. And the remainder of the budget is other operating expenses. The largest single item in there is postage, which totals 6.6 million. Exhibit 5 shows the 22 allowance broken down by function. So the two largest categories, the Compliance Division and the Revenue Administration Division, these are the two largest divisions by funding. Combined, they total about 46% of the entire budget. And these are the two divisions that handle the primary tax processing responsibilities of the agency. Also next, again, the IT-related functions. There's the Annapolis Data Center and the IT Services Division, as well as the ITS Major IT Project. The remaining 19% of the budget, which is broken out on the right of the chart, this covers the agency's executive direction and administration, as well as several of the other fiscal responsibilities the agency provides to the state, such as the General Accounting Division, the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, the Field Enforcement Bureau, and the Central Payroll Bureau. Exhibit 6 is the change from the 22 budget from the 21 budget. Starting off with personnel expenses. I'm going to make sure this is too big to have the entire chart fit on the screen. So I'm just going to start with the personnel expenses. They combined increase by 1.5 million. The biggest increase here is for the annual salary review. There's a 2.2 million increase for that. The next is for turnover adjustments. There's a 1.7 million increase for turnover adjustments. And this is related again to the Board of Public Works cost containment actions. They had increased the turnover rate to approximately 8.2% for fiscal 21. And the budgeted turnover rate in the 22 allowance is about 6.2%. So due to that decrease in the turnover rate, there's about a 1.7 million increase in personnel expenses. And there's also a centrally budgeted cost of living adjustment, which is about 700,000. And the largest decrease is for regular salaries. This again reflects that transfer of positions and funding to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. There's about a 1.5 million decrease in the 22 budget. That's due to the fact that the transfer in 21 was only for half of the fiscal year, from January 1st to June 30th. And in fiscal 22, that's reflecting the full year of those transfer out of funding to cover the full year of those positions being transferred out. I'm going to move down to the bottom section of the chart, which shows the other. I'm going to zoom out so this fits on the screen here. The bottom part of this chart shows the other operating expenses. Again, I'm going to start with the bottom line. The bottom line is the biggest, the ITS Major IT Development Project. This reflects an $18.4 million decrease in the contractual services for that. Outside of the ITS project, the remainder of the agency's budget actually remains fairly stable. There's a decrease of about 170,000 or less than 1% from the 21 allowance in the remaining areas of the budget. But there are a few changes here. The biggest other change is the Annapolis Data Center cost allocation. This is a centrally budgeted item based on the share of usage of the Annapolis Data Center. So the Comptroller's Office share decreased and some of the other state agencies increased their share of usage. So there's a 900,000 decrease for that item. There's an 800,000 increase for contracts related to the Annapolis Data Center maintenance and operation. There's a variety of maintenance contracts for the hardware and the software associated with the maintaining that. And there's also a $450,000 decrease to the comptroller's IT services division, which, to clarify, these are separate agency IT expenses that are separate from the ITS project or the Annapolis data center, and those decrease by about $450,000. The other increases in the chart, I would note that these are related, the office supplies and the vehicle purchases, these are related to the cost containment actions for 21. These were both items that were reduced in 21, so the budget in 22 is basically putting those expenses back in at approximately the same level as in 21 in the original appropriation. So that's why those are showing an increase. I'm going to move now to the personnel data section. So as I mentioned, there's about 1,100 positions agency-wide. The vacancy data at the end of calendar 20, there's about 120.5 vacant positions, which is about 53 vacancies over the budgeted turnover rate in the 22 allowance of 6.25%. And as I mentioned previously, this is a decrease in the turnover rate from the 8.23% that the Board of Public Works had adjusted the rate to as part of their cost containment actions in 21. The analysis document also includes a couple of issue item descriptions towards the back of the analysis. I want to briefly touch on those. The first is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on tax collection and enforcement activities. The Comptroller's Office took a few different actions throughout the year related to the pandemic. I think the first was in the spring of 2020 was the delay of the tax filing deadlines for personal income tax and various tax types, 90 days to July 15th. The other item is the governor had issued an executive order early on in the pandemic directing agencies to suspend certain collection activities to provide economic relief to the state of Maryland. And along with that executive order, the Comptroller's Office announced a temporary cessation of tax collection efforts. Exhibit number 7, scroll down here. Exhibit number 7 shows several of the usual tax enforcement and collections activities that the office engages in. And as you can see on the chart related to that executive order and that action by the agency, they decrease in each of these categories in fiscal 20 related to the previous fiscal years. The agency also noted that following the July 15th extended tax deadline, they sent out letters to certain tax filers who had delinquent balances of unpaid taxes owed. However, these were for informational purposes only, and they were not enforcement activities. But I would note that due to the state statute, they're still required to pay interest and penalties. This is not kind of eliminating those liabilities. It's just suspending those, and there will eventually have to be interest and penalties paid on those. The second item we have in here is related to the Relief Act of 2021, and the agency has noted that there were some implementation costs to their operating budget that would arise in fiscal 21 and 22, approximately $330,000 in total, based on the costs to the agency to implement some of the provisions of the bill. I think the largest item in the bill that the office is responsible for is the processing of the economic impact payments to individuals who had filed for the earned income tax payments in fiscal or in tax year 2019 and 2020, if applicable. It's estimated about 422,000 individuals would receive payment. So that was kind of the main item in the bill that the comptroller's office was responsible for implementing. And I've heard in the press that most of those payments have been processed already through the end of last week. There was also another provision in the bill that allowed for payments to individuals who had filed for unemployment insurance and are awaiting adjudication on that, which the comptroller's office will be responsible for sending out, and the provision exempting unemployment insurance payments that individuals have received from state income tax filing for tax year 2020, as well as some various other business tax provisions as well. The agencies advised that for those provisions relating to filing for tax year 2020, there would have to be retroactive changes made to some of the tax forms. And due to the fact that the tax season has already begun or recently began at the beginning of this month, it was not possible to have all of those corrections made. So there would have to be a second set of tax forms issued, and both sets of forms, the original versions and the retroactives, would both have to be accepted for filing. And the comptroller's office has advised that it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks in order to develop, test, and program the necessary changes for those tax forms. I also, this was finalized a couple weeks ago, so there were some items in here that were not fully reflective of the final version of the bill that was passed, some of the additional amendments that were added on. But one item I was going to note also is that DBM has processed the budget amendments for the funds for the economic impact payments and the payments to UI claimants. So the fiscal 21 working appropriation will eventually reflect at least between $100 and $200 million extra in fiscal 21 for those general funds that were transferred to the comptroller's office for the processing of those payments. Then I'm going to move to the recommended action section from DLS in the document. DLS is making 2 recommendations. The first recommendation is to increase the budgeted turnover rate to 7.75%. As I mentioned earlier, the currently budgeted turnover rate for fiscal 22 is 6.25%, and the most recent vacancy data rate in the agency is about 11%. And since the Board of Public Works had set the turnover rate for fiscal 21 at about 8.2%, DLS had recommended that it could remain at that level. However, we are noting that since there are extra costs that the office will face due to implementation of those Relief Act provisions, we are recommending to adjust the turnover rate to slightly lower than that level set by the Board of Public Works for 21. So the recommendation that DLS is making related to that is about a $1 million general fund reduction and a $100,000 special fund reduction. The second recommended action is adopting narrative on the integrated tax system project, similar to what was submitted last year in the 2020 Joint Chairman's Report. We're asking, or rather we are recommending, that the committees ask for a brief status update at the end of the year on the status of the project and if there have been any cost or timeline adjustments for the project. Lastly, I would point out, I'm not going to go through the appendices for the sake of time, but I would point out that there were 4 separate Office of Legislative Audits reports for 4 of the different agencies' divisions that are included, the summary findings for your reference, as well as information on the JCR reports submitted during 2020, and a further summary of the integrated tax system project. But with that, I will conclude my presentation and I can take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Quist. I see no questions from the Senate side. Mr. Chair, I see no questions from the House.
That's correct.
at this moment. I would like to call up our Comptroller Peter Francho, Madam Deputy Comptroller Sharon Bernardi, and Mr. Dennis Krzyzak, Director of Office of Administration and Finance. And anyone else that our Comptroller says is.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Chairman McCray and Chairman Haynes, all the members of the subcommittee. I see several senators and delegates who are friends of mine. Thank you for the opportunity to present the fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Office of Comptroller of Maryland. I'd like to first acknowledge, obviously, the professionalism of Samuel Quist for an outstanding and fair analysis that he's done of our agency's budget. We are grateful very much to him for working collaboratively with our agency, and therefore each of the subcommittees working collaboratively with us. I'm joined by all the directors of the agency. I would obviously like to highlight my indispensable Deputy Comptroller, Sharon Bernardi, and also Director of Administration and Finance, Dennis Krzyzak. My division directors, members of my senior staff, and I were happy to answer any questions you may have at the conclusion of my remarks. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would like to, in the interest of time, abbreviate my oral testimony and my written testimony, which has been submitted for the record. I think each of you have.
Yes, sir.
Just briefly note the weirdness of the year that we have experienced. It's been unlike any other in the history of the Comptroller's Office, or frankly, the country. And I'm incredibly proud of the 1,100 employees of the agency, many of whom worked straight through the pandemic to make sure that payments for items such as personal protective equipment and test kits could be processed swiftly and safely. For their often unheralded yet crucial efforts, I and the entire state are grateful. This budget reflects our shared desire to find even more ways to build upon our successes as an agency that delivers customer service in the most fiscally prudent way. We remain committed, as we have during my 14 years as comptroller, to deliver respectful, responsive, and results-oriented taxpayer service. Famously, there's no such thing as a Republican tax return or a Democratic tax return. They are Maryland tax returns. Last year, during a tax season that began on time but ended later than usual due to the pandemic, I'm proud to report that we processed more than 3.2 million tax returns, dispersed more than $3 billion in refunds, and over 90% of Maryland taxpayers received their refunds within 3 business days upon filing their tax returns. This year, we saw yet another series of unprecedented events with the recent passage of the Relief Act and the delayed start to the 2020 tax filing season, which officially began on February 12th, a little more than a week ago. This year saw, which officially began on Friday, February 12th. I'm proud to report, and this is something that I think stands out among all, frankly, state agencies, 98% of economic impact payments have been processed within 4 days of the Relief Act becoming law on Monday, February 15th. One of those 4 days was a snow day, Thursday. Specifically, 266,985 electronic payments with a value of $113.6 million have been transferred to banks for deposit electronically into individuals' accounts. And 148,972 paper checks totaling $61.7 million were processed and mailed by the close of business Friday, February 19th. Last week, 450,000 taxpayers visited the Relief Act web portal, and my staff responded to more than 700 social media inquiries. You all remember the Affordable Care Act when we went public with the, whatever it was, the website. Remember? And then it froze and everybody went crazy. Well, they just did one of these up in Massachusetts around vaccinations. They put up a big portal. Everybody should sign up. This was just last Thursday. 2 hours later, the thing had crashed, burned, gone. And it obviously drives people crazy. We had 450,000 taxpayers in 2 days visit our portal. And I'm delighted to say, of course, I stayed up late at night worrying about it, but I'm delighted to say that it actually worked. Our employees have fielded 14,000 phone calls in the last few days. 14,000 phone calls to our 800 number. The average wait time was 57 seconds before they got a live, friendly, real voice on the phone. 57 seconds average for 14,000 phone calls. We also added answered 4,400 email inquiries. At the very same time, coincidentally, simultaneously, we started the tax season, the regular tax season, and we processed 160,000 individual income tax returns since we opened on February 12th. One cannot underscore how incredible an achievement this is all around, and it's even more astounding an achievement considering that Monday was a federal bank holiday last week ago today, and last Thursday saw the closure of most state government offices due to a snow emergency. Through these challenges, the 1,100 employees of the Comptroller's Office have proven that government can rise to the occasion and complete Herculean tasks that make a difference in Marylanders' lives. They remain committed to delivering the respectful, responsive, and results-driven customer service that Marylanders should expect and deserve. And I frankly could not be more proud of them. Trust me, if it hadn't worked, you guys would have been all over me, or would be all over me, understandably, because somebody has to take responsibility. But since it worked, I'd like to give a pat on the back to the people that made it work. And thank God we have them. As with all functions in the Comptroller's Office, I remain focused on making sure that our Relief Act payments have been dispersed in a safe way. However, I will note for the record that more than ever, fraud is on the rise in this tax administration space, not just for us, but for every state. My agency continues to take every conceivable step to protect against fraud and identity theft. Someone filed an unemployment claim for Peter Francho last week. Thank God our HR division headed it off before the payment was actually made. That's not our agency, that's the unemployment Department of Labor, but I'm just saying fraud is all over the place these days. Since I took office in 2007, we've intercepted and blocked more than 120,000 fraudulent returns and prevented the disbursement of more than $225 million in fraudulent refunds. We're proud of our state-of-the-art detection model that can identify suspicious concerns, regardless of how sophisticated the criminals become. Last year alone, our award-winning questionable returns detection team blocked 21 preparers, and since 2016, my agency has blocked 236 preparers. These are tax preparers that file numerous refund applications. We have blocked 236 of them at 250 locations. I'm grateful to Attorney General Frosch and his team for working closely with my employees to bring fraudsters who prey on innocent and hardworking Marylanders to justice, and also protect the general fund of the state. I'm especially proud to report that close partnership between the Field Enforcement Division and the Attorney General Office has resulted in a 100% conviction rate or guilty rate, with only 3 cases closed by exception. I'm also happy to report that in our mission to maximize both customer service and taxpayer protection, we're making tremendous progress and are on schedule and on budget with our transition into Compass, a new state-of-the-art tax processing system that replaces our current 25-year-old SMART system that is costly, inefficient, and obsolete. I'm sincerely grateful to Deputy Comptroller Bernardi, who's leading our agency's effort to ensure a smooth and seamless transition to our new tax processing system. And I will note for the record, the reason there's such chaos with the unemployment payments is because they have an antiquated, out-of-date infrastructure that day after tomorrow at the Board of Public Works, we're going to be approving literally hundreds of millions of dollars in new costs because their infrastructure wasn't kept up. So they can't answer the phone. They can't process. They can't tell what side is up. And don't get me going on the vaccine rollout. That's another subject. But the point is, you in the legislature have a very important role in demanding that we upgrade infrastructure in state agencies. Otherwise, we're going to end up with something like Texas is going through right now on an unrelated infrastructure issue. But by consistently implementing new, innovative, and aggressive strategies, our compliance division has collected $7.3 billion in delinquent taxes over the last 13 years. I must stress these are not new taxes. Rather, these are taxes lawfully owed to the state. And I will also say for the record that we are not the IRS. We don't go out and get blood from a stone. If someone needs leniency and flexibility, we give it to them. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the governor's emergency orders, we've temporarily suspended auditing and collection functions, given the unprecedented economic crisis our state is experiencing. Some people take advantage of that. Most people don't. And let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, I'm enormously proud of the successes and results that the agency has been able to deliver under such incredible circumstances that we've lived under now basically for a year, if you can believe it. Thanks to the professionalism and dedication of the team at the Comptroller's Office, as well as our agency's longstanding relationship, frankly, with both of these subcommittees, we continue to provide the level of service despite the enormous challenges brought about by the COVID pandemic. I respectfully ask for your support of the Comptroller of Maryland's fiscal year 2021 budget request in order to continue the successful work we've undertaken on behalf of Maryland's taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, for that very thoughtful response. Just want to see if there are any questions from my colleagues. Mr. Comptroller, I see no questions from the Senate side. Mr. Chair, I see no hand raised from the House side.
We don't have any on the House side. And again, Mr. Comptroller, good to see you.
Yeah, I have many fond memories, Mr. Chairman, back in the day.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Mr. Comptroller, can I speak on behalf of the legislative, the DLS recommendation?
Excellent. Go ahead, sir. Thank you, Dennis. I'm sorry I skipped over that.
Yes, I'd like to point out that we respectfully disagree with the recommendation to increase our overall turnover to 7.75%. If the governor's allowance currently has our budget at 7.42% of general funds, this increase of $1 million in turnover will drive our turnover up to 9.21%. Since July of last year, through the Board of Public Works and then this allowance, the agency has lost $4.2 million from its original appropriation through this legislature last year. An additional $1 million is going to, put us in a burdensome position to keep staff on and be able to do our job functions.
Thank you, Dennis. And please take that under advisement if you can. We've already paid at the bank.
Thank you. And seeing no further questions, I'd just like to thank our DLS analyst in reference to the work that he did, Mr. Quist. And we'd also like to thank the Comptroller and the team on behalf of both committees. Just want to say thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thanks. I'm getting off unless you need us.
Yes, sir. At this moment, we'll move on to the briefing from Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, and that is once again going to be Mr. Samuel Quist.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you. Once again, my name is Samuel Quist. I'll be presenting the DLS analysis of the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. The fiscal 22 allowance for the commission is $3.6 million, which is an increase of $1.4 million from the 21 working appropriation. This increase is primarily due to the fact that the fiscal year 2022 is the first full fiscal year of commission operations, and whereas fiscal 21, the personnel were only in place for half of the fiscal year since January 1st. Moving to the fiscal 21 discussion, The Alcohol and Tobacco Commission was established by Chapter 12 of 2019 and further modified by Chapters 359 and 360 of 2020 to provide further clarification and to give the Commission its legal authority to conduct its alcohol and tobacco regulatory activities, as well as to specify the transfer over of these functions from the Comptroller's Field Enforcement Division where they were previously held. The pieces of legislation I mentioned specified that the effective date would be January 1st, 2021 for the statutory change of the responsibility of alcohol and tobacco regulation to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, that it was also the effective date for the transfer of funding and the positions from the Comptroller's office. There was a budget amendment processed shortly before the new year that transferred 27 positions and 1.6 million in associated general funds for those personnel costs from the Field Enforcement Division to the Comptroller, to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission for its staffing. Additionally, the fiscal 21 budget bill included a couple of specifications that required that transfer, as well as the providing of office space by the Comptroller at its Annapolis offices, as well as access to the document and licensing database currently used by Field Enforcement Division for the alcohol and tobacco licensing and enforcement activities for at least the second half of fiscal year 21. The fiscal note for the original fiscal note for Chapter 12 of 2019 noted that there would be additional costs of implementing the Commission's operations, and there could be, depending on the timeline of fully implementing the Commission and its operations, there could be additional costs that are yet to be determined in subsequent fiscal years. This analysis also notes that there was a cost containment action taken at the Board of Public Works. There was a reduction of $220,000 in general funds, which was about 25% of the Commission's fiscal 21 allowance. This was due to the fact that the 21 budget bill had originally included a budget anticipating that the Commission would begin its operations on July 1st at the beginning of the fiscal year before the legislation was passed to delay that implementation until January 1st. So less operating expenses were needed since the Commission was only in existence for half of the fiscal year 21. I'm going to move now to the overview of the fiscal 22 allowance. So the majority of the budget is made up of personnel expenses. 3.1 million of the 3.4 million allowance is personnel expenses. The remainder of the operating expenses include office supplies and other supplies and materials, as well as motor vehicle maintenance. Those are the two largest categories. Exhibit 2 showing the changes in the 22 allowance. So again, the personnel expenses are the largest category of increase, and this increase in 22 is reflective of the fact that fiscal 22 is the first full fiscal year of Commission operations, and it is an annualization of the personnel costs that were only in place for half of fiscal year 21. There are also some other miscellaneous operating expense changes. These changes for office supplies and communications, again, these are kind of related to the Board of Public Works cost reductions, and they add in these expenses similarly to what was included in the original 21 budgeted amount to keep those at a similar level. There's also a decrease in motor vehicle purchases due to some motor vehicle purchases that occurred during fiscal 21. And there's also an increase for an additional 1 contractual personnel for 22. The personnel data section, there's 30 total regular positions and 1 contractual. This includes the 27 positions that were transferred from the Comptroller's office. And lastly, under the DLS recommended actions, DLS is recommending to concur with the governor's allowance for the Commission, and we have no further recommendations. So that concludes the presentation for the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mr. Quist. At this moment, I see no questions from the Senate side. I see the chairman shaking his head no. I don't see any from the House side. At this moment, we'd like to bring up our acting director, Mr. Anthony Hatcher, our chairperson, Mr. Lynn Foxwell, and their team to discuss the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission response.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the.
Mr. Hatcher, if you could speak up just a little bit, it's pretty
Can
low.
you hear me any better now? Can you hear me okay?
You're very drowned out.
Can you hear me now?
I can barely hear you. Let's just go with what we got.
Okay, I'll try to talk closer to the microphone. I just want to say that my name is Anthony Hatcher, and the acting director of the new Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, and that I concur with the allowance as described by Mr. Quest, and I want to thank him for his analysis of our agency. We are just getting off the ground and getting set up. As he indicated, we had the 27 positions that were transferred earlier in the middle of January. And we are proceeding to get this agency in a good operating order. And that is all I would have to say as far as the operation of the agency at this point. We're just getting off the ground.
And that's a great response, Mr. Director, Acting Director Hatcher. I'm going to chime in with our chairperson Foxwell if he wanted to add anything.
Chairman McCray, Chairman Haynes, distinguished members of the committees. I learned a long time ago in this business to leave the committees and the analysts at yes. When they agree to concur with the governor's recommendation, don't say anything that will put yourself in jeopardy. I will simply say that it's a profound honor and privilege to have been appointed by Governor Hogan to serve on this inaugural Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. And I'm deeply grateful to have earned the trust of my fellow commissioners who just a couple of weeks ago elected me to serve as its inaugural chair. And it's important work that we're doing here because the stakes are high. The public health, the public safety of Marylanders hangs in the balance, as does the well-being of our small business climate and of the Maryland economy as a whole. And fortunately for all of us on this call, and fortunately for all Marylanders, we have the best and most accomplished team of regulators in the country on the job since day one, ready to carry out the people's business. And we look forward to providing seamless continuity of operations from the old administrative model to the one that this General Assembly has established in its wisdom. And with that, I'll leave you. And again, thank you for this opportunity to lend comment.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the committee?
No.
Okay, seeing none on my side, I saw Delegate McKay go put his glasses up. I thought we would get a question, but no, we don't have any questions. Just want to say,
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Acting Director Hatcher and Chairperson Foxwell, just want to say thank you for leading the effort. We know that you will do well. And to Mr. Quist, for the fine report, just want to say thank you for your leadership in reference to Maryland. At this moment, we'll end this briefing and we'll go to our next briefing from the Department of State Police. And at this moment, I'd like to bring up Budget Analyst, Mr. Nicholas Consman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just share my screen here. Okay, so we'll jump right into Department of State Police's fiscal 2022 budget analysis. We can see that the budget increases by $12.3 million or 2.7%. And that's largely driven by growth in general fund expenditures. These purple bars here represent reimbursable funds that essentially reflect CARES Act funding that was received from the federal government and cover expenses related to public safety salaries and protective equipment. That funding is not present in the 2022 allowance. And so the general funds are returned to what would be their normal levels in 2022. Looking at Exhibit 1, we can see that crime rates per 100,000 have decreased in Maryland as well as the nation, pretty much in tandem with one another. However, when we look at Exhibit 2, the murder rates per 100,000 in Maryland as well as the United States, you can see that Maryland is quite a bit higher than the rest of the nation and has been for about the past 5 years or so. Looking at the fiscal 2020 closeout, there are 2 items of note here. The first being that the Office of Legislative Audits conducted their statewide review of budget closeout transactions and found that state police had a persistent special fund deficit of $509,000 in the salvage vehicle inspection program. And this has been an ongoing deficit since OLA first found it in their 2015 fiscal compliance audit. The second item of note is the presence of $74.5 million of coronavirus relief funds. This was made available from the federal government to replace general funds related to public safety salaries. And so that's what's really driving a big chunk of the reversions in state police in fiscal 2020. Moving now to fiscal 2021, the Board of Public Works adopted $413 million of cost containment actions related to the coronavirus pandemic, $7 million of which were reductions to the state police's appropriation. One of the main items of note here was that there had been plans to close one base in the Aviation Command. However, following the release of a basing study performed by the department and consultant, they found that the closure of one base would have adverse effects on the command's response time. And so this decision was ultimately reversed by the governor. There are other various reductions to IT costs, contractual services, and facility expenditures. One other item of note that we'll be touching upon in the capital analysis is the decision to co-locate the Baltimore Regional Intelligence Center with the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center. And that's going to yield $1 million in general fund savings. This was originally planned to be its own standalone facility within Baltimore City. The department also receives $5.8 million in 2021 deficiencies, the largest chunk of that being for the licensing division, which is receiving additional funds to cover overtime expenditures, facility modifications, and to fund contractual personnel. This is primarily needed to address significant increases in firearms applications that the division has been receiving within the past year or so. Looking at the agency spending in Exhibit 4, we can see the 2022 allowance. The biggest chunk of that is going towards personnel expenditures, both civilian and sworn. It makes up 84% of the allowance in 2022. The operations of the various divisions and bureaus make up a smaller percent of the remaining funds. So the biggest chunk goes towards the Support Services Bureau, which includes IT projects as well as the Aviation Command. Looking at Exhibit 5, we have the proposed budget. We can see, like I said, that the total growth in the budget is $12.3 million or 2.7%. And if we scroll down just a little bit onto page 11, we can see that the big ticket items here are mainly going to be driven by personnel expenditures. In fiscal 2022, Saliola members are receiving a 4% salary increase as well as a salary increment. And that totals $14 million in additional personnel expenditures. There's also 21 new positions that are going to the licensing division to address those increases in caseloads, and that's $1.4 million there. And then other line item to note here is that funding for MSPAC has been restored in the 2022 allowance, consistent with the decision to maintain all 7 of their bases, as well as retaining all of the personnel and aircraft. Looking at the personnel data, as I just mentioned, there's 21 new positions, and that's all going to licensing division. This includes 13 civilian positions to perform the first round review of licensing applications, as well as 8 sworn officers to perform background checks on applicants. However, it's worth noting that as of January 2021, there are 8 civilian vacancies currently present in the licensing division. And so it's not immediately clear why an additional 13 positions are needed beyond those vacancies. It's also worth noting that for the 21 new positions provided in the governor's allowance, these positions do not have turnover taken into account. Typically, 25% turnover adjustment is applied to new positions to account for the time that it takes to advertise, recruit, and perform necessary background checks for these positions. However, that was not the case with these 21 positions. Looking at Exhibit 6, we can see the weekly number of firearms applications compared with the weekly overtime expenditures. The green bar here shows that the average weekly number of applications received went from about 1,000 in fiscal 2018 and 2019 to almost 3,000 in fiscal 2021. And at the same time, overtime expenditures have grown just about exponentially over the past year or so. When we look at the number of hours of overtime worked by these employees, it tells essentially a similar story. And so taking into account the need for these new positions, as well as the current vacancies in the department, DLS is recommending encouraging the department to fulfill existing vacancies prior to receiving additional positions. And so we recommend deleting 8 of the new positions provided to licensing division so that they provide a net increase of 13 assigned civilian staff that are needed to reduce the workload resulting from the increase in licensing applications. And we also recommend that additional funding be deleted to reflect the necessary turnover adjustments for the remaining new positions. Turning now to issue number 1, discussing MS-PAC operations. You may recall during the 2020 session that members of the General Assembly had been concerned about the personnel limitations currently present in the command and the impact that has on operations, particularly in some of the sections in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. As of June of 2020, however, MS-PAC reports that the command has returned to 24/7 operational coverage to all 7 of its bases, including the Cumberland section and the section in Easton. And this was achieved by promoting pilots within the command, as well as hiring additional pilots with the help of DBM and AFSCME. As I mentioned before, there's also a base realignment study that had been commissioned by the governor as well as the department to determine if it was feasible to actually, in fact, close one of their bases. And these bullets here highlight some of the findings of that study. The main takeaway here, though, is that the study recommends against the closure of any base in the Aviation Command and recommends against the sale of any aircraft currently within the command. They found that the closure of any base within MS-PAC would adversely affect the response time and bring the response rate from 95% of calls responded within 25 minutes and would take that down to 83% of calls. And so with that, the governor did decide to reverse the BPW decision to close any base and restored the necessary funding associated with that closure. However, the 2022 allowance does reflect an increase of $1.1 million for additional salary enhancements. And it does raise concerns about the considerable cost of maintaining a fleet that has been present for several years now. Given the fact that 80% of MS-PAC is financed through MEMSOF, and the prior discussion this committee has had with MEMSOF and the pending insolvency date in fiscal 2025, it does raise concerns about the ongoing costs associated with maintaining the fleet. And so with that in mind, we're asking the department to comment on the recommendations of the basing study, in particular, the recommendation to renegotiate maintenance contracts and its plans to implement any of the other recommendations of that study. The second issue very briefly relates to the Uniform Crime Report and the state's transition to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. The 2019 Uniform Crime Report has been submitted on time for the first time in several years, by the department, and that's attributable to a new IT system that has streamlined the collection of crime data from local agencies, as well as the data verification process. We are recommending that the committees adopt annual budget language in reference to the 2020 UCR again this year. And just to transition on the transition to the National Incident-Based Reporting System as required by the FBI. The Department of State Police is currently in full compliance with this requirement from the FBI and is currently working with local agencies to assist them in becoming fully compliant at the local level. And we are asking the state police to comment on this transition, and we are recommending the adoption of committee narrative to provide a final update to the budget committees on this transition to NIBRS, as well as compliance among local law enforcement agencies. To conclude, there are 4 recommended actions, and just to recap, the first relates to the deletion of 8 civilian positions provided to the licensing division to account for current vacancies. The second increases the turnover expectancy to 25% for the remaining new positions to the licensing division. The third recommendation is relates to the adoption of committee narrative for the transition to NIBRS. And the fourth recommendation is annual language restricting funds pending the submission of the Uniform Crime Report. And that concludes my analysis, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Councilman. Are there any questions of the committee? Okay. Mr. Chair, at this moment, I see no questions from any senators or delegates and want to proceed with the agency. I would like to bring up Mr. Al Colonel Jones from the Department of State Police and his team.
Good afternoon, Chairman McCray, Chairman Haynes, and members of the budget committees. I'm Colonel Jerry Jones, Superintendent of the Maryland Department of State Police. With me today on this Zoom call are Lieutenant Colonel Delane Brady, Chief of our Support Services Bureau, and Mr. Paul Abel, our Chief Financial Officer. I would like to thank our budget analyst, Mr. Nick Konzelman, for his work on our budget analysis. He has been very professional during this process, as always, and has worked well with our budget office. If you don't mind, I'd like to get right into the analysis. You have our written testimony, so I'll be brief. Beginning with page 16, as it refers to the recommendations for PIN reductions and increasing turnover to the licensing division. As mentioned in the analysis, the workload at the licensing division has tripled in the last 3 years, while our number of employees has remained constant. This workload being handled by our employees is unprecedented. Other state agencies, very fortunate to us, have loaned us personnel to keep up with the increased applications to purchase firearms, yet we are still using $300,000 a month in overtime. And there does not seem to be any end in sight in this workload. Since the first of this year, our weekly average for firearm applications is over 2,000 per week. This pace, as I said, shows no signs of slowing up. We do need your help. The added positions given to us by DBM are key to the continued success of the licensing division. The analysis indicates we have 8 vacancies. As mentioned in our response, 2 of the 8 positions are currently filled, and the other 6 positions are in the final stages of hiring. Our argument against reducing the PINs also ties into our opposition to the increasing of turnover for the division. Delaying the hiring of employees directly impacts the division and their ability to keep up with this caseload. MSP has made the success of licensing division a top priority. As we move on to page 18 with the MSP Aviation Command realignment study, in 2020, the Maryland State Police Aviation Command contracted with a firm to perform an independent study of our basing structure. The original intent was to ensure our base locations and operations were providing the best response time and services. The study was later modified to determine if the Aviation Command could perform the same functions with one less helicopter base, and if so, where would that base be located? In October of 2020, the results of the study were provided to the Maryland State Police. The study found that the strategic locations of the 7 bases we currently have are an important factor and response times to provide emergency care for patients. The study also confirmed that the elimination of one helicopter base would significantly and negatively affect both the response rate and response time. The resulting study also suggested that the Maryland State Police negotiate its master services contract to explore the cost and feasibility of decreasing the maintenance repair time. When the contract's open, we will renegotiate with this in mind. Moving on to page 19 and the transition to NIBRS. The department continues to work with local law enforcement agencies to assist the FBI with the FBI reporting requirements. As noted in our response, the FBI, due to COVID, has softened their compliance date of January 1 of 2021, and we are currently sending test data to the FBI so that they can check for errors. This is all part of that process. Under the FBI guidelines, our submissions must be error-free for 6 months before state certification can be approved. We will continue to publish the UCR summary data reports until the NIBRS system is completely up and running in Maryland. Moving to page 21, the operating budget recommended actions. Item number 1, delete new civilian positions to the licensing division to account for current vacancies. As previously discussed, the department does not concur with this recommendation. Number 2, increase turnover expectancy to 25% for new positions in the licensing division. Our response is that we do not concur with that recommendation. Number 3, adopt committee narrative requesting a 1-year update on the implementation of the National Incident-Based Reporting System. The department concurs with that recommendation. And finally, number 4, add language to restrict funds pending the submission of the 2020 Uniform Crime Report. The department concurs with that recommendation. Chairman McCray, Chairman Haynes, thank you for the opportunity to speak to both committees today on these important topics. There is another important topic I must mention before I close. It's the allegations reported to members of the Legislative Black Caucus by current and former Maryland State Troopers of inequitable treatment because of their race. I want to be clear that while I'm superintendent, I will not tolerate actions towards another member of the department or toward any citizen that are taken because of a person's race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, gender identity, disability, religion, or sexual orientation. That is not who I am, and that is not who we are as the department. We have clear and very specific policies in place prohibiting this type of behavior. I've made it clear to every employee that those policies will be strictly adhered to and swiftly applied. I met with the Legislative Black Caucus about their concerns. I have the follow-up meeting with Chairman Barnes in March when I will provide him with information requested by caucus membership. I will also be providing information about further steps being taken to guard against even the perception of racism within the Maryland Department of State Police. I look forward to working with the Legislative Black Caucus, other members of the General Assembly, and our employee groups on this and other important issues. I would be willing to meet with any member to discuss these issues further. And thank you for the honor to appear before you today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Are there any questions of the body? Chairman Haynes.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Jones, always good to see you. Thank you so much for testimony today. I'm not going to repeat what you've already said, and that is, I just wanted to highlight the concern of an issue, a couple of issues raised by the Legislative Black Caucus, but more importantly, on issues as it relates to policies of equity, that the Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee began to look at last year. So all I would like to just mention is to reiterate, if you could keep the subcommittees apprised of the progress that you're making and reports to submit them for the members of the subcommittee as well. And one issue which I don't want to get into the weeds with today, but is also looking at recruitment efforts within your department in order to see whether or not the staff, the officers or a true reflection of the demographic makeup of the state. And if there are resources that you do not have that you may need to beef up or do some innovative things to recruit well and capable candidates, let's do that. And that may be something that we can talk about offline to do over the interim. And thank you much for everything.
Yes, sir. Be happy to get together anytime, sir.
Thank you, Senator Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't hear anything mentioned about vehicles. Are we okay with our upgrade of vehicles?
Yes, sir. We're moving along on our vehicle path and a replacement program, and I'm happy to say that is moving as been prescribed and previously described in these meetings, sir. And we appreciate your support for that.
And are they on schedule for the opening of the Cumberland Barracks?
Yes, sir. We had an update on that. Obviously, COVID played a part in a small delay in that completion, but we are looking at April 2nd is what we're looking at, with hopefully we'll have a ribbon cutting of sorts sometime in May, but we'll certainly keep you posted on the progress there.
And a follow-up to Chairman Haynes, I was going to ask a similar question, looking at recruiting, and you can add that on to what he suggested. Overall recruitment, are we getting a lot of applicants or not throughout the state?
Our team is working very hard. We just seated a class of 50 in January 11th, and that was a great class because we have 40% total diversity and 18% African American, and we have my team has put a great program in play to try to avoid COVID. So we're actively working our recruiting pieces consistent with COVID, but we are seeing an increase in our recruiting opportunities, and that certainly bleeds over into our aviation command as well, as I know you have specific interest in that. I'm very happy to say that since our last conversation, we've been 24/7 fully operational. So we do have a couple vacancies there that we're actively recruiting on in the aviation side, but we are in fact increasing our presence in the field as we have been since I've been back for a year now.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Edwards. Look like Senator Sailing, the old school way.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Jones. I appreciate all the information. I just want to get back also to the recruiting. I know it's tough getting the recruits out there. Is there any way that we could probably assist or help in ways that we can recruit more people to be, our state troopers? I know we've had problems in the county to getting more people, and there's many reasons why, but I'm just saying if we can get and help this and assist it in some way throughout the state, that we can make sure we have that number out there that's going to do the job, because you guys it's a tough job out there, just maintaining out there on the highways. So if there's any more we can do, please let us know so we can assist and help that out, and I appreciate that.
I think what I would say to everyone is put your hands on the shoulders of a young person that is interested in this profession and steer them our way. We have a very clean process. We've automated a lot of it. There's a lot of things that occur every day that streamline that process. It's not as long as it used to be. We have 150 recruiters statewide that are heavily engaged on our primary goal, and that is creating a workforce that parallels the demographics of the state of Maryland. And that's what our goal is. And we're not stopping until we get to that goal. But it's really something with a lot of the trust issues out in society right now. It's going to take all of us to put our hands on these young people, point them in the right direction, reinforce the fact that they can do it. They can do this job. And if we can get them to that place where they hit submit on that application, we will take care of the rest. So just that partnership with our community leadership, I think that is really what we need to continue to build this profession, not only at the state police, but in every law enforcement agency in Maryland. But thank you for your interest in that, sir.
No, but thank you. And if we can, if it's a possibility, we can find out the number where we're short. Because I think it's important to know. I know we're short, but if we can find that number of how many we're short, I think it would be a help also too. So thank you very much.
Very good, sir.
Thank you, Colonel Jones. Just a couple quick questions. One of them, I'm gonna start with the vehicle theft fund in reference to, I know that we get a report out, we can see the jurisdictional payouts, we can see how many cars have been recovered and things of that nature. But one of the things that I don't always see is the actions in reference to how we awarded the funds. So what were the actions that that specific jurisdiction were taking to get the results that they were trying to drive to? So I'm not sure if you can speak to that at this moment, but if you can get us information in reference to what did those jurisdictions do with that money, that would be very helpful. So that way it could be some modeling for other jurisdictions that could work. Like what's the top 3 things that actually helped us with our vehicle theft fund to make sure that stolen cars wasn't a big issue in that respective jurisdiction? That would be helpful.
Yes, sir. I will get that report. It's very comprehensive. We work together every year to get those grant applications through the committee, and I will get you the outcomes and what processes are using to reduce vehicle theft in their respective areas throughout the state. I'll get that to you.
Yeah, and my next couple questions come from, I guess we've had a senator, and I know that Senator Peters, the chairman of Budget and Tax, has joined with a couple colleagues that had this issue that you just discussed, in equity and diversity within the agencies around promotions, disciplinary actions, and recruitment. So I guess my first question would be, do you all have some form of a social media policy for those folks in decision-making places within the agency that decide on misconduct or disciplinary action?
Yes, we do have policies. I lost a part of that. You were kind of skipped out, but I think what you were saying was basically social media usage on and off duty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Is that a correct assessment? Yes, we do have those policies. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to navigate that to some degree because there are certainly our First Amendment rights to expression of opinions. However, when that brings the department into the question, if they're using the department or it's representative of the department, that's when it crosses a line into an administrative misconduct. So, but we do have policies associated with that, and I can get that to you.
I was going to say, if you could send that over, and just to comment on that, obviously, if a person has that ability to making decisions over misconduct or any type of disciplinary action, and then they see that there may be some form of a bias there, obviously, you notice that that's an uncomfortable situation for that.
Absolutely. I understand the concerns there.
Yep. The second question would be in reference to, we know that 11 to 13% is where we travel in reference to Black folks within our troopers, within our MSP. Could you speak to whether you all have any goals, a goal that you would like to reach in mind? Maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 33%. If you could speak to that, or the agency's position in reference to goal setting for having a diverse workforce.
Well, and that's what I mentioned earlier. I mean, it's very clear in our recruiting plan for this year that our goal, and we were not going to stop until we get to this goal, is have a department that reflects and parallels the demographics of the state. So we have a ways to go. We recognize that. We certainly are open for opportunities of improvement or ideas. As was mentioned earlier, we need to get outside the box and stay there on a number of fronts. It is a challenging time. We are holding our own. I'm very proud to say, my first class as superintendent had an 18% African-American presence and a 40% overall. That's a great number for us. That certainly moves us in the right direction, but we know there's more work to do. So that is our goal at this point. And we're going to continue working feverishly. We have the right team, our personnel command that oversees our promotional stuff, our hiring process. For all African-American commanders, and they are committed to helping us get to that end game that we're seeking.
Yep. In reference to the goals, can you talk to us about attrition? So like how many Black officers within the state troopers are you losing on a yearly basis? Because obviously that factors into how many we should be thinking about recruiting, or what does that diversity look like?
Okay, if I may, Chairman, can I defer to Lieutenant Colonel Brady, because she works with those numbers every day. Okay. And I will defer to her on that.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, both Mr. Chairmans and subcommittees. With regard to attrition, the state police attrition, we lose and hire approximately 7 troopers generally monthly. As far as African American versus white, I would look the numbers, since the numbers are so small, generally the numbers are so small monthly. So I believe that the attrition numbers were put into the paperwork for the caucus. If I could refer to that document while I'm speaking, I could give you those numbers, or we can send them to you after so that I don't delay.
Either works, and I'll keep going. And Lieutenant Colonel Brady, you may be the correct person. If you could speak to how many sworn officers do we even have that's African American within our state troopers? I know that it's the 13%, but I don't know the specific number.
It's 172, sir. It always kind of stays that number.
Okay, perfect. In reference to recruitment, and I know that Colonel Jones had already stated that he's going to be getting us this information, but do we have a coordination with our HBCUs, maybe fraternities, sororities, to help us with our recruitment from that standpoint?
We do, sir. Over the past at least 5 years, I can tell you, I always say this, we were able to move from the cafeteria to the classroom. So for me, that's some doors that have been open. We are working on relationships, building them with the mentors in the college, and specifically those associated with the degrees that are most helpful or most likely to want to find themselves in law enforcement or public safety. And I would also say that if the department ever finds a young person who decides that maybe the state law enforcement is not their cup of tea because they want to stay local or they want to stay close, we always make sure we refer them to any law enforcement agency in the state of Maryland. So we are in every HBCU in Maryland. We started reaching out regionally. I know that we mentioned this during the caucus, and we continue to develop very good relationships.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the command staff is what I would call it. I'm not sure what you all would call it, and I'm more familiar with BPD's command staff and how they're structured. But can you talk about the diversity of the command staff for the state troopers at this moment?
Sure, same thing, sir. With specifics, I could refer to the document and tell you how many African Americans representative of each rank. Mm-hmm. But for us, we start gradually. So our first and second line supervisors would be our corporals and sergeants. Mm-hmm. You move then from supervisor to administrative, and that's your first and second line administrators, which are your lieutenants and first sergeants and lieutenants. And then we get into management, which is your captains, majors, and then appointed positions, which is your leadership. Mm-hmm. The department's curriculum focuses specifically on that. But of course, sir, you know, as well as all of the members on the subcommittee, we have got to get young African-American troopers interested in taking the promotion. It is offered every 2 to 3 years, depending on our business need. Once you get in that, it is every rank, highly competitive, and you have to be in it in order to continue to move forward.
You will be getting us that information. I apologize.
Absolutely, sir.
I missed the caucus hearing because I had pension subcommittee at that moment. I'll ask my last couple questions in reference to civilians. Can you talk about how diverse the civilian appointments are at this moment?
Yes, sir. So civilian, we do the very same thing. With regard to representation, I would say to you that the last that I looked, even across executive agencies within government, the state police does very well. We're in the high, I would say 20%. I'd have to double check. That is also in your information. We try to provide the same level of progress for civilians to move up. We have made great strides in directors and leaders for our civilian positions. All of that is in the caucus information. It's basically the same information we were putting in JCR reports since the 2014 report was required of the department. So we continue to manage and monitor all of those metrics.
Got it. The last question is in reference to diversity and bias training. Do you all currently have some type of process, or is that in action at this moment? And if so, what does that consist of?
Yes, sir. So the department for the past 8 years has had a fair policing training practice, and it came back all the way back to the consent decree for the department. It's been called many things for those years, but I think most what most people hear now is implicit bias training. There's a 4-hour block done in the academy, and then incumbent training is done. Depending on the topical area, it could be 1 hour for every year. It could be triannual. There are different topics that are offered as well, which is done by our professional policing commander and has been done for the past 8 years. So there's a summary of implicit bias, fair policing, or fair practice policing training that has happened and consistently happens in the department.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from any members of the committee?
No, I think you've covered fairly well. Not a senior from the House side, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Colonel Jones, Lieutenant Colonel Brady, and Nicholas Councilman, our budget analyst, just want to say thank you for your leadership in reference to the state of Maryland and what you do for Marylanders each and every day.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, sir. Have a good afternoon.
Yes, sir. That ends the hearing for state briefing for state police. We're now move on to our final briefing, which will be Division of Pretrial Detention with our Department of Public Safety. I'd like to currently call up our budget analyst, Mr. Jacob Cash.
All right, I believe I'm sharing my screen. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, I will be presenting on the Division of Pretrial Detention and Services. This agency operates the Baltimore City Pretrial Complex, as well as several correctional facilities in Baltimore City and the Pretrial Release Services Program, which interviews, investigates, and presents recommendations to Baltimore City courts about individuals who are accused of crimes in Baltimore and are held in pretrial supervision. Beginning with the performance evaluation, Exhibit 1 shows the number of arrestees who were processed at BC-BIC, which is the Baltimore Central Booking and Intake Center, as well as the number who were committed to pretrial detention. Those decreased by about 20% in fiscal 2020, and the rate of commitment stayed around 50%, which is about average for the past few years. The population of the facilities in this function also decreased in fiscal 2020. It didn't decrease as much as arrestees, and that's because the effect of court closures weren't quite seen in this population until after the fiscal year closed. So in fiscal 2021, we'd expect that average daily population, especially among sentenced offenders, to decrease. Actually, among local detainees, that population has stayed relatively stable and actually increased for several months during the pandemic. And that's related to the court closures, which are causing backups for the processing of pretrial individuals. Moving to assaults, the peak was in 2017 at 500. These are offender-on-offender assaults. And in 2020, we saw the decrease continue. They're currently at about 270 assaults, which was 9% of a decrease from 2019. Moving to the Pretrial Release Services Program, Exhibit 4 shows the number of cases that were received during the year. That slightly increased from 2019 to 2020. And again, that's slightly related to COVID-19. More people were placed on pretrial release supervision because courts were wanting to avoid congregate settings like the Baltimore jail. And pretrial investigations decreased in 2020, which could also be related to the court closures. And in terms of the performance for PRSP, the orange bars shows the number of individuals who failed to appear at their court hearings, and that number decreased by half in fiscal 2020. The failure to appear rate is also at 3%, which is much below the goal of about 8%. And the number who were arrested on new charges is also under 1% for the second year in a row. PRSP, again, could have been affected by COVID-19. Courts weren't requiring individuals to appear for about the last quarter of the year. So we would expect that decrease, but since it did decrease by about half, there is almost no way that COVID-19 was responsible for that entire decrease. So moving on to the overall spending for the department, or for this function, excuse me, this is a $236 million budget, and the majority of that is in general funds. The green bar is in federal funds, and those are for the Chesapeake Detention Facility, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. The spending overview, about 3/4 goes towards personnel, which is pretty common for the Department of Public Safety. And about $27 million goes towards inmate medical costs. And the rest of the operational expenses are broken out into that green section. The proposed budget change is about $9.3 million reduction, and those are split out in the where it goes chart. The personnel expenses decreased on whole, and overtime earnings decreased by $2 million. That's slightly because of improvements in hiring and attrition for this function, correctional officers specifically. But it also has to do with the fact that overtime decreased during the COVID-19 epidemic because staffing needs were less intense, specifically because there was less movement within facilities. Turnover adjustments also removed about $2.8 million from the budget. That's kind of the opposite of what's happening with overtime. This adjustment brings the budget in line with real vacancies. And in this personnel section, we can see the vacancy rate is currently about 15% and is quite close to the turnover expectancy for the department. Some other major changes were in critical maintenance, and there's a $3.75 million decrease compared to the working appropriation. However, this is not quite true. It's actually a $1.6 million reduction because the department's critical maintenance as budgeted has changed. The department provided a new list, which is in Exhibit 8, and the money that is being deferred from pretrial detention is being added to the correctional budget. So next week in that hearing, there will be another exhibit which will show the projects that increased in that budget. So again, with personnel, there is 1,860 allowed positions in this budget, and the vacancy rate is in line with turnover expectancy at about 15%. However, when we look at the vacancies by classification, we can see correction officers have the lowest vacancy rate at 12%, which is an improvement over past years. However, all of the other classifications are quite high in terms of vacancies, especially supply officers, which are 70 or 62% vacant, office and fiscal staff, over half of which are vacant, and the same for psychologists and social workers. This brings us to the first issue, which is substance use disorder treatment provision by the department as a whole and specifically within Baltimore City. Since 2015, the department has tried to procure a vendor for SUD services. However, all of the solicitations have either failed or been withdrawn. Now, this is important because many of the individuals who come into the facilities in Baltimore City are struggling with either were charged with a drug possession or struggle currently with withdrawal, addiction, and require services. Contraband for dangerous controlled substances are also on the rise, and that was an issue in the administration analysis. Now, Chapter 532 of 2019 required a medication-assisted treatment pilot program to be implemented in the Baltimore City pretrial complex by January of 2023. And this requires the division to expand the current provision of MAT services. They currently continue inmates on methadone who came into pretrial detention already using methadone, and they also offer initiation. However, in fiscal 2020, we only saw 3 pretrial individuals initiated on methadone, and this is out of about 10,000 commitments to pretrial detention. Now, the legislation that was passed in 2019 requires buprenorphine and naltrexone to also be offered. And those can be preferable to people in pretrial detention because they don't require long-term commitment to daily structured administration of the drug. Those who are going in and coming out of temporary custody are usually not wanting to enter methadone initiation because they'll have to commit to using it every day and having a provider after they're released being connected. For a lot of people, that's not ideal. To bridge the gap, since 2017, there has been a PCare mobile treatment facility that stands for Project Care at Reentry. The pre-care van is available for inmates leaving pretrial detention, and they are inmates as they're screened when they first come into pretrial detention are referred to PCare, and as they leave, within their first 48 hours is the most important time for addicts to have this bridge between incarcerated life and their life in the community, because that's when overdose overwhelmingly occurs. In 2020, 55 pretrial individuals were referred to the PCare van and about 34 received treatment within 48 hours of their release. This is a voluntary and nonprofit service, so there's no there's no requirements put on individuals, and there's no funding from the department that goes towards PCARE. Speaking on funding, this is the real issue. Funding has been appropriated at high levels, about 6,000 or 7,000, but the department has underspent that, only spending about $2 million, or I misspoke, it's 6 or 7 million, and the department has only been spending about 2 million. Now, this includes not only staff who exist in the facilities, like the psychologists who I mentioned earlier with the high vacancy rates. It also includes contracts for external services. This is the issue that the department has been having, where the procurement for an external service is not successful. And in the last legislative session, the department was undergoing a procurement and finished that procurement at the end of the fiscal year, bringing forth that contract to the Board of Public Works. However, that solicitation was canceled, as they let us know in a joint chairman's report, which was required due to budget bill language, which restricted $100,000. Because the solicitation was canceled, the restriction of $100,000 was withheld continuing until the department submits more information, which they can still do this fiscal year to receive that restricted funds. However, it would be providing an update on their substance use disorder treatment service provider, which they're currently behind schedule on. The RFP was meant to be released in November of last year, but it still hasn't been released to this day. So it is unlikely that before the first quarter of fiscal 2022, they will have a provider. And it remains unclear how that $4.7 million allocated for the treatment service provider will be spent. Now, DLS is recommending 2 actions be taken on this issue. The first would be to restrict the entire appropriation for their substance use disorder treatment sub-programs. That's $7.1 million, and they wouldn't be allowed to use those funds in other sub-programs, although they would be allowed to move them around between them. The second action would withhold $100,000 again in these funds until they submit another report on their new treatment provider and the pilot program for MAT in Baltimore City. The next issue that we'll be talking about is the Chesapeake Detention Facility and the funding of which. In Exhibit 12, we can see the federal funds that have been dedicated every year, and since 2019, those have been insufficient. We've required general funds to fill the gap between the reimbursement from the federal government and the expenses that are incurred at that facility. And now in 2019, a lot of those costs were related to critical maintenance and salary increases, but those, especially salary increases, have continued and are going to continue until the contract ends in December of 2025, which is fiscal 2026. So there are 4 more years past 2022 that we will likely require to spend more general funds to fill the gap between our reimbursement and our expenditures. To reiterate, this is a facility that is operated on behalf of the U.S. Marshal Service, and it is a federal detention facility. It is not a state or local detention facility. And the general funds added to this budget represent a subsidy to the federal government. Specifically, the department, when initially making this agreement, received $20 million in capital funds. And so far, since 2019, we've spent $21 million in general funds, including fiscal 2021 and 2022, which have not closed out. However, if we continue this pattern forward, the department or the state will clearly have to provide a significant amount of subsidies to the federal government until this contract expires. And so last year, the budget committees restricted $1 million in funds for this agency, for this facility, and required the department to go back to the table with the U.S. Marshal Service and try to renegotiate the agreement for a higher higher payments to receive more cost. You know what I'm saying, excuse me. So like I said, this renegotiation occurred, but it has not been completed. They reached out, but there's still ongoing discussions between the two parties, DPSES and the Office of the Federal Detention Trustee. Since DPSES did reach out and there are currently ongoing discussions, the funds that were restricted in fiscal 2021 were released. However, DLS is recommending budget bill language again in the 2022 allowance, restricting $500,000 for another report detailing the renegotiation effort and any way that public safety can reduce their reliance on general funds to fill that gap between the federal reimbursements at CDF and the actual expenditures. The recommended actions, as I mentioned earlier, are three. The first is restricting all of the funds in substance use disorder treatment subprograms. The second would restrict the $500,000 in CDF until the renegotiation report. And the third would restrict $100,000 until a report is submitted on the SUD treatment service provider and MAT pilot program in Baltimore City. With that, my presentation is concluded, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have for me.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee of Mr. Jacob Cash?
And on the House side, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. At this moment, I would like to bring up, I see Secretary Green and Chief of Staff Sessa to give the report out for pretrial detention, Division of Pretrial Detention.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman McCray, Chairman Haynes, Vice Chair Proctor, members of the Senate Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment Subcommittee, and members of the House Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee. For the record, my name is Robert Green, and I'm the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. With me today virtually is Deputy Secretary of Administration, Mr. Chris McCulley, Chief of Staff, Rachel Sessa, Assistant Secretary, Gary McElhaney, and Commissioner Michael Resnick. The department appreciates its ongoing collaboration with the Department of Legislative Services. And again, as always, we appreciate Mr. Cash's hard work and his thoughtful analysis. The DLS analysis contains 3 recommended actions. The department respectfully disagrees with the first 2 recommended actions and disagrees in part with the 3rd recommended action. And in advance, we'd like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to explain the context of those positions. The first recommended action is to restrict $7.1 million in substance use disorder treatment subprograms to be only used for those subprograms. The department completely understands the intent of the recommended action, but again, respectfully disagrees with the amount identified for restriction and its necessity. The funding in this sub-object is already dedicated to personnel expenditures for departmental treatment staff, substance abuse testing, and supplies. And as such, no restricted language should be required to meet that objective. In essence, these are programs and services that in many cases are already in operation as we speak. Additionally, the main issue raised in the DLS analysis is the agency's lack of a substance use disorder treatment contract. As noted at the top of page 7 in the DLS analysis, the total amount of funding budgeted for this contract is $4.5 million, which is significantly less than the proposed $7+ million in restriction. Last year, when I appeared before you, and we as a department, we were very close to awarding a substance use disorder contract, and we recognize the work that has been going on since 2015. I were very excited by the progress that had been made since the agency had struggled to reach that point in years past. However, as noted by the previous presenters, and I don't mean to rehash it, but the entire landscape involving the delivery of this critical treatment changed in an instant when the pandemic struck. We were able to pivot and institute new practices and procedures with our pre-existing medical treatment contractor, as well as our mental health treatment contractor. We quickly realized that some of these practices put into place should absolutely continue post-pandemic environment, including telehealth, telepsychiatry, as well as teletreatment. And we wanted to also establish a single point of entry into the Division of Corrections, which we can discuss more at length in that DOC budget. but all of the treatment modalities and methodologies that we learned during the pandemic had to be incorporated into this contract. The solicitation for substance use disorder, unfortunately, went out months prior to the pandemic, so it did not include a number of these elements that we now accept as tried and proven practices that must be there. After great deliberation by the department, myself, I am a huge supporter of getting this substance abuse treatment provider in-house. But in the interest of assuring every element necessary to deliver these services under what is now a new normal had to be included within that contract, and they simply were not. The department's working diligently to restructure the solicitation to incorporate these lessons we've learned through this global pandemic, and again, reimagine every service that we have as we move forward. This restructuring of the solicitation requires input and review by department medical treatment providers who are overseeing COVID-19 testing, treatment, vaccine rollout, and quite frankly, the complete operational know-how of our department needs to look at this. We respectfully request the committee take into consideration the very unprecedented impact of COVID-19, this crisis, and support the department's efforts to assure this essential program is well designed, well sourced, it is deliverable, and it is inclusive of the operational realities as we know them today and moving forward. The department also disagrees with the second recommended action, which is to restrict $500,000 in the Chesapeake Detention Facility funds pending renegotiation of that agreement. The department previously fulfilled an identical reporting requirement 3 months ago, and the funds restricted based on this reporting requirement were released. As outlined in the report submitted in December, the department's made significant effort to try to bring the federal parties to the table in order to discuss the negotiations of the contract, including telephone calls, letters, and emails. These efforts are documented in the report that was submitted to the budget committees 3 months ago. We did finally have a fruitful meeting with the U.S. Marshal's Office on January 13th of 2021, but we were informed that additional representatives of the federal government had to be consulted and brought into the fold. We've attempted to secure these meetings with the additional representatives and reached out multiple times since that date. While the department intends absolutely to renegotiate the contract in the manner that I think is expected, we will continue making every effort to do so, but I would ask again respectfully that the agency not be penalized for a lack of response from that entity. Additionally, the $500,000 in general funds is predominantly budgeted to cover inmate medical care and costs for those detainees at CDF. Restricting these funds would inadvertently, I think, negatively impact the agency's spending. The department shares the budget committee's concerns and is willing to update the committee on the continued efforts to renegotiate the contract to the satisfaction of all, but a restriction of that fund I do not think is our immediate solution. Therefore, the department respectfully again requests the committee reconsider and take into consideration our comments during your deliberation and reject that recommendation. The department disagrees in part with the third and final recommended action, which would restrict an additional $100,000 in funds pending receipt of a report on the agency's progress to secure a contract with the substance use disorder vendor. Again, we agree, I agree in full that securing this contract to expand our substance use disorder treatment is absolutely critical. Respectfully, it seems that restricting the $7.1 million and then the additional $100,000 is kind of a double hit for us as a department. The department has no issue at all with submitting any report on this very important matter, and the department will work extremely hard to ensure its reporting requirements are met and that the legislature receives all of the information requested in a timely manner. We're happy to submit that report when asked by the committee, but we would ask again for you to reconsider and reject the withholding of those funds pending receipt of the report. I thank you, Mr. Chair, as always, to elaborate on and be able to expound upon our answers in this forum, and we are prepared to respond as well as the staff I brought with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Secretary Green. Are there any questions of the committee? Secretary Green, I see none. One of the things that I have been asking of Mr. Jacob Cash is, I know that because of the Justice Reinvestment Act, and we can see the trends in reference to the population decrease, and just getting an understanding of how that correlates with the staffing would be helpful, especially after reading this analysis. I think that every analysis, that's what I keep running through in my mind, is getting a better understanding of how does that correlate with the staff. I know that our overtime isn't in the manner that it used to be, and that's probably because of somewhat of the population decreases that's happening, but just understanding from my educational standpoint, you see it every day. I get to see it every time you come here for the 30 minutes, an hour would be helpful. I see no further questions, so I will not belabor it, Secretary Green. Just want to see if there are any closing comments from my fellow chairman from the House side.
No, not at this time. I don't think there's any questions from the House PSA. And thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Green, and Secretary Green, and the great job that you and your department's doing.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Yep. In reference to Budget Analyst Jacob Cash, Secretary Green and your team, just like to say on behalf of all the senators and every agency that has presented, every budget analyst, just thank you for your service to our great state of Maryland. This hearing for PSTA and PSTE and PSA today. Thank you all for joining. Y'all have a blessed day.